Some stories arrive neatly packaged. They come with police reports, signed statements, timestamps, and a stack of paperwork thick enough to stop a door from closing. Investigators love those stories. Everything is documented. Every step leaves a trail. You can trace events from beginning to end, like following a set of footprints in fresh snow. But then there are other stories that exist in a stranger space. They circulate quietly between people who work in certain professions. Police officers, emergency responders, people who have seen enough of the world to know that sometimes reality doesn't behave the way it's supposed to. These stories rarely come with documentation. They're passed along in conversations, retold online, shared late at night between officers who insist the story came from a guy they know. And no matter how much time passes, the story refuses to disappear. This is one of those stories. It begins with a police officer named Jeremy. At least, that's the name most commonly attached to the account. Whether it's his real name or not is difficult to confirm. When stories travel this far, details sometimes get blurred along the way, but the central event stays the same. Jeremy had been a police officer for more than a decade, long enough that traffic stops had stopped feeling dramatic. If you ask most officers what they do all day, you'll hear something surprising. It's not high-speed chases and movie-style investigations. A huge portion of police work is routine: traffic stops, paperwork, more paperwork, and occasionally even more paperwork. Jeremy had performed hundreds of stops over the years, maybe thousands. He'd seen every possible reaction a driver can have when flashing red and blue lights appear behind them. The nervous driver who immediately begins apologizing before you've even said hello. The overly friendly driver who suddenly wants to tell you their entire life story. The confused driver who somehow forgot the speed limit, even though the sign is approximately the size of a refrigerator. Most stops blur together, until one doesn't. It was an ordinary afternoon shift, clear weather, light traffic, nothing unusual on the radio. Jeremy was parked along a stretch of road he had patrolled countless times before. The kind of quiet roadway where officers sometimes wait for minor speeding violations. Not the dramatic stuff, just enough to remind drivers that the speed limit actually exists for a reason. At some point during the shift, he noticed a black sedan pass by. The car wasn't racing. It wasn't weaving between lanes, but it was moving just slightly above the speed limit. Not dramatically, just enough that Jeremy could justify pulling the driver over. He activated his lights. The sedan slowed down immediately and pulled to the side of the road. No hesitation, no sudden movements. In police terms, this was what you might call a textbook stop. Jeremy stepped out of his patrol car. By now, the process was practically automatic. Approach the vehicle, introduce yourself, ask for license and registration, maybe issue a warning, maybe issue a ticket. Then both people continue with their day. Jeremy walked toward the driver's side window, and that's when everything stopped. The driver looked up. Jeremy froze. Because the face looking back at him wasn't just familiar, it was impossible. Same eyes, same jawline, same slight scar near the eyebrow. A scar Jeremy remembered clearly. He had pressed bandages against that exact spot years earlier when his teenage son had come home after a skateboard accident. His hands began to shake. 2 years earlier, Jeremy's son had been declared dead. At least, that's what everyone believed. A massive earthquake had struck the region where his son had been working temporarily. Buildings collapsed. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Rescue operations lasted for weeks. When the dust settled, hundreds of people were missing. Jeremy's son was one of them. Search teams never found his body. Eventually, authorities made the determination many families dread: presumed dead. Jeremy had stood beside an empty coffin at his son's funeral. No remains, just a wooden box representing someone who was gone. He had delivered a eulogy. He had accepted condolences. He had gone home afterward to a house that suddenly felt too quiet. And now that same face was sitting behind the wheel of a black sedan, alive, breathing, looking directly at him. Jeremy stepped away from the vehicle for a moment. He had to breathe. Because the first explanation that comes to mind in situations like this is usually the correct one. Coincidence? A stranger who simply looked very similar. The human brain is excellent at recognizing faces, and sometimes a little too eager. He returned to the driver's window. Routine. Stick to the routine. License and registration. The driver handed them over calmly. Normal. Nothing suspicious. But when the man spoke, Jeremy felt the air leave his lungs. The voice sounded exactly like his son's. Not similar, exactly. Jeremy tried to focus on the task in front of him. Name, age, destination, standard questions. The driver answered them, but when Jeremy asked for the driver's name, the man hesitated for a moment. Not long, just long enough to notice. Jeremy's heart started racing. Something inside him was screaming that this wasn't coincidence. So he did something no police officer should normally do during a traffic stop. He started asking personal questions. Questions that had nothing to do with speeding. Questions about childhood memories, about places, about events only his son would know. The driver's expression slowly changed. First confusion, then unease, then something else. Recognition. And that's when Jeremy noticed something hanging from the rearview mirror. A small silver pendant, scratched, worn, but unmistakable. Jeremy had given that necklace to his son the night before the earthquake. His knees nearly buckled. The driver looked at him again, and this time his voice dropped. "Dad, please don't arrest me." At this point, the story becomes complicated because there is no official public report confirming what happened next. What exists instead are retellings, and strangely, many of those retellings share the same core details. According to the most widely repeated version, the truth came out slowly. Jeremy's son had survived the earthquake, but he hadn't escaped without consequences. He had suffered severe head trauma, confusion, memory loss. When rescue teams were pulling survivors from the rubble, he had no identification, no way to prove who he was. In large-scale disasters, chaos creates gaps in the system. Hospitals fill quickly, temporary shelters are overwhelmed, records get lost, people get displaced. Sometimes survivors move from place to place without ever reconnecting with the systems meant to track them. According to the story, Jeremy's son ended up in exactly that kind of situation. He was moved between temporary facilities. Eventually, he encountered people willing to help, and sometimes help comes with strings attached. The story claims he was taken in by individuals who exploited disaster survivors for labor or identity fraud. Without documents and with damaged memory, he was extremely vulnerable. Meanwhile, back home, Jeremy believed his son was dead. And his son believed his family believed the same thing. Two lives moving forward in completely separate directions. One built on grief, the other built on survival. Jeremy didn't issue a ticket that day. Instead, he called for backup, not to arrest the driver, but to make sure no one else did. According to the story, what followed involved hospitals, DNA testing, and months of recovery. Piece by piece, identity was restored. Memory returned gradually. And a father who believed he had buried his son discovered he had actually buried an empty chapter. But here's where the mystery deepens. There are no confirmed public records tied to this exact story. No department has officially claimed it. No detailed case file has surfaced, which raises the obvious question: did this really happen? Some investigators believe it could be a real case that was kept private, due to legal protections and personal privacy. Others believe it's a story that evolved over time, maybe inspired by real disaster scenarios, maybe shaped by the very human desire to believe that sometimes the people we lose can find their way back. Skeptics also point out certain challenges. Earthquake disaster zones involve extensive identification efforts, missing person databases, DNA comparisons, international cooperation. But disaster experts admit something uncomfortable. Even with modern systems, large-scale disasters still leave gaps. Bodies are never found. Records are incomplete. People slip through the cracks. Families sometimes bury empty coffins. And sometimes, survivors reappear years later in ways no one expected. So where does that leave Jeremy's story? Some people believe every word. Others believe it's a powerful urban legend built around real-world possibilities. But what keeps the story alive isn't proof, it's plausibility. Because the idea isn't completely impossible. And sometimes that's all a story needs. One line is often quoted when the story is retold. Again, it's impossible to confirm whether Jeremy actually said it, but the quote survives. As a cop, I've seen death every day. But that day reminded me that sometimes the dead come back. Whether literal or symbolic, the idea resonates because this story isn't really about a traffic stop. It's about grief, about how disasters erase identities, about how systems meant to protect people sometimes fail them, and about the unsettling possibility that somewhere out there, someone believed to be gone forever might still exist. Driving down a quiet road, waiting at a traffic light, or sitting behind the wheel of a car, looking back through a window, at the person who thought they had already said goodbye.
That's another case closed here in the Rotten Swamp. The truth always surfaces, no matter how deep it's buried. If you're hungry for more dark mysteries, hit subscribe and ring that bell. Until next time, keep your doors locked and your secrets buried deeper than mine. This is Rotten Swamp, where justice never rots.